This is part one of our section on animal ethics. I want to start by talking about the current approach, or what Sunstein calls the status quo regarding animal ethics. So currently, the view is that it is wrong to be cruel to animals, and so animals have rights that protect them against cruelty. So animals cannot be left outside, they cannot be beaten up, or things like that. Now, Sunstein also identifies two problems with this view, or the current approach. The first problem is that prosecutors aren't always available in order to defend animals in our legal institutions. For instance, if a dog is left outside, there might not be a prosecutor who is willing to stand up for the dog in a court setting. So animals do have rights, but they are not able to advocate on behalf of their own rights. A dog cannot appear in court, a person has to appear in court for them. In addition, there are exceptions to those rights. For instance, in cases like hunting and factory farming. These are not illegal practices, and so as a result, many animal ethicists have moved beyond the status quo and are trying to find a new way to think about animal ethics. So basically, there are two approaches to animal ethics today. There's the animal welfare approach, and there is the animal rights approach. So the animal rights approach is Kantian in flavor. What it says is that all animals, including us, ought to be treated as an end in itself, and they should not be treated merely as a means. So if you remember our discussion of Kantian ethics and about how we should treat people, the idea is that we should basically translate this to animals. And so what this means is that animals have a full body of rights, a full body of moral rights, and they're pretty strict. It turns out that we can't use animals for anything. We can't use them for food, we can't use them for entertainment, we can't even use them as pets or as test subjects. Even if that behavior is beneficial to the animal. And we'll look at an example of this later. So the other approach is the animal welfare approach. And this says that we ought to increase the well-being of animals, or we ought not to cause them unnecessary suffering. So the welfare approach is kind of hedonistic in flavor. This position implies that we consider the well-being of all animals every time we perform an action. So what this means is that when we think about whether we want to eat a cheeseburger or not, we should think about the small amount of enjoyment that we would get from the cheeseburger and weigh that against the immense amount of suffering and harm that we cause to the cow that would turn into the burger. So would I get the same amount of enjoyment as suffering would be pulled from the cow? Or is that not really a fair trade? So I've thought up of three different practices that can help us clear up the distinction between the animal welfare approach to ethics and the animal rights approach to ethics. So the first kind of behavior that I want to look at is animal testing. So it's long been practiced that certain cosmetic companies will use a test where they take rabbits, they put them in these machines where they can't move, and they rub ointments or chemicals on their eyes, and they're not given any sedatives or any painkillers, and they're left for 2 weeks with no food or water, and they observe what happens to the rabbit's eyes. Oftentimes it's very painful and excruciating for the animal, and then afterwards the rabbit is killed. So according to both approaches, this is wrong. This kind of experimenting is wrong. And it's wrong for a couple of different reasons. So according to the animal welfarist, the animal welfare approach, this is wrong because it causes undue suffering to the rabbits. For the animal rights approach, this is wrong because it violates this idea that we should only treat animals as ends in themselves. When we experiment on these rabbits in this way, what we're doing is we're treating them as a means to an end. We're treating them as things that we can use in order to make our lives a little bit better. So the second kind of behavior, or might be when we use animals for entertainment. We'll look at the example of a zoo. So when we enclose animals inside of a zoo, take a bear for instance, what we might be doing is we might be actually making that bear's life a little bit easier. It always has access to food, it's not really in danger of anything. And so in this case, we might actually be increasing the well-being of the bear. So according to the animal welfarist, they might be okay with zoos, as long as it's the right kind of zoo. If the animal is happy in the zoo and it's increasing that animal's well-being, then they're all for zoos. Zoos are a good thing. However, according to the animal rights approach, zoos are always a bad thing. We should not have zoos. Because when we use animals in zoos, what we're doing is we're using them as a means to our enjoyment. We're not treating the animals in there as ends in themselves. We're containing them and we're making them do what we want in order for our entertainment, even if it is better for them. The last case, or the last behavior I want to look at, is eating meat. So when we eat meat, when we eat meat and when we raise animals for human consumption, we oftentimes keep them in small cages, so they live pretty miserable and short lives. Now, according to animal welfare, this is most of the time this is going to be wrong because it causes suffering. And to the animal rights approach, this is always going to be wrong because we're using the animal again as a means. We can think of maybe like these kind of happy farms where cows are raised and they're allowed to roam around, and then one day they just keel over and die, and then we eat them. Or if an animal is hunted and it lives a natural life, and then it's hunted and killed. These are a little bit different because according to the animal welfare approach, as long as we're not negatively affecting the well-being of the animal, this kind of practice is okay. So there's a lot there to kind of digest and a lot to think about for your weekly discussion posts. I'm very interested if you have been involved with any of these animal rights movements. Perhaps if you've ever stopped eating meat for a while, I would love to hear about that experience. It might be interesting discussion topics as well. I look forward to reading those, and I will see you next week.